Thank you so much to Rana for a fantastic job moderating the previous panel. And I hope that the audience is really getting why this conversation is broader than just antitrust. I think Heather in the previous panel did a fantastic job at describing the whole-of-government approach and the way in which really antitrust, together with industrial strategy and trade, are connecting. They're part of a joint effort. I am incredibly thrilled to welcome on this panel in Brussels Katherine, the trade ambassador. She, I know, was, of course, yesterday in the Trade and Technology Council in DC and had the incredible energy to fly overnight on the red eye and be here today. So it is a particular great thank that I put to her. I want to start with you and really explore this nexus between trade and competition. You have been appointed last September, I believe, to the President's Council of Competition. And you have expressed views on how trade connects with competition and in particular anti-monopoly. So can you explain and unpack it for this audience? Because this is not an audience that has any kind of familiarity in general with trade. That's not what we do in competition. But you've put it very well. I'd like you to unpack it.
Well, it's a delight to be here with all of you, and I'm feeling very awake right now. It's mostly thanks to this European coffee. But it was important for me to be here. I really, really want to be here. And I'll tell you that it's not natural for a trade person to find herself at an antitrust conference, much less the Woodstock of antitrust. So I think this is the perfect question to start with, because it turns out that at this time of incredible dynamism and change in the world and in the global economy, I find myself more often than not trying to build bridges of understanding and trying to push myself and my discipline into other people's lanes, because our disciplines tend to silo themselves, and it turns out that everything is connected. So I come to antitrust from trade. I am improving my proficiency in antitrust, and for all of you who are here, who are antitrust experts, let me say a couple things. It's really thanks to an increasing friendship and also partnership with colleagues in the administration like Alina Khan, Jonathan Cantor, Rohit Chopra as well. I know he'll be on the program later, formerly of the FTC, now at the CFPB. For me to realize that a lot of the change vectors that we are grappling with in trade are actually also things that you are grappling with and evolving into in antitrust. So I'll just highlight a couple of them. One of them goes to something that Heather just mentioned on the previous panel. The fact that the trade paradigm for the last many, many decades, this globalization free trade paradigm, was built on a kind of an idolization, but certainly a fixation on maximizing efficiency. That efficiency, liberalization of trade, became the end in itself, not a means to accomplishing another end. And so I think that that's something that we have very much in common with antitrust. That also meant that as we thought about people in our economy, as we thought about justifying our trade policies and our trade liberalization, the one benefit that we hung our hat on was the benefit of efficiency, which is low prices. And one of the results of that is we've seen a version of globalization that perpetuates a race to the bottom, the cutting of costs, the exploiting of people and planet. As I've learned more about antitrust, it is an issue around detaching yourself from the consumer welfare standard to bringing in other factors and goals. And from our perspective, that is about thinking of the human being in the economy that you're trying to benefit as not just a consumer. It turns out that in order to consume, you also need a job. You need to earn a wage. Every consumer is also a worker. If we're only pursuing policies to benefit people as consumers, and those policies are actually impoverishing those people as workers, the entire system doesn't work, and in many ways explains why we are where we are right now. The injection of the public interest standard in antitrust, again, this is not really my area, this is your area, is also an enormous theme in what we're trying to do in trade, which is to break ourselves out of the assumption and the proxy that what is good for the biggest corporate stakeholders in our system equals what is good for America and Americans. I think for a long time we've pursued this assumption that, well, these are iconic American companies. They are brand names that we're very proud of. Therefore, anything that is good for them will be good for us. That benefiting the companies will create that trickle-down benefit to the company's workers and the communities where those workers live. And we've seen over time that just isn't happening. It just isn't happening. So in this pursuit of evolution and progress in terms of our trade policies, I've discovered that we are in fact connected to our antitrust cousins. And in many ways, we are trying to accomplish the same goals using different sets of tools. And that's why it is really important to have conversations like this. And that's why I am really honored and delighted to be invited into this conference.
Expand a little bit on what this means, for example, in the digital space, and then going beyond digital to the real world in which we know supply chains have been brittle and weakened by the pandemic. So you, as trade, are connecting with an anti-monopoly vision that is in fact very close to the one of the antitrust agencies, and this is incredible to hear. But I'd like you to expand a bit more on what it means for the policies that the US is pursuing, because to be frank, there is also, of course, questions being asked. There is, Europeans may not immediately understand what, and we'll go to Francesca in a moment, but what is the final goal? I'd like you to expand on this.
I'll do this in the form of telling a story, and I'll try to make it short and just hit the highlights. It turns out that these days, a large part of the conversation around trade is around digital trade. And the question has been posed, what is digital trade? And this is actually, it's a profoundly important question, because even in trade, we pursue digital trade knowing that this is the thing that is relevant to all of our lives without ever stopping to really define what we're talking about. And so I'll explain to you my own education here. I came to digital trade and the negotiations around digital trade agreements and digital partnership chapters, treating these issues and provisions very much the way a traditional trade person would. In trade, you're always being pulled in different directions by different stakeholder sets. It's always a balance between winners and losers, and you're always trying to thread that needle where you can balance out the interests, or you can try to create something new to pull yourself out of a zero-sum situation. So with respect to the provisions in our digital chapters as they've evolved, that's how I approached them at the beginning. When it came to digital trade chapters, they started as e-commerce chapters in our free trade agreements. And it's because in the early 2000s, if you think back to where the digital economy was in the early 2000s, we thought about digital and technology essentially as an enabler or facilitator of traditional trade, traditional goods trade. And so that meant that we were looking for rules that would liberalize digital flows to facilitate trade flows. So What I discovered, because I knew that, well, the world is very, very different today than it was back then. What I discovered is we actually can't take that approach to the digital issues today. And it is because, let's just take the issue of data. Initially, we thought about data as bits and bytes of information that needed to cross borders very freely in order to facilitate the flow of trade and goods. It turns out that today, there is that function of data, but data itself today has become the commodity itself. That the data is the thing that has value, and the data has an incredible power, and who has the data and who gets to decide where the data goes and how it flows has become an issue not between stakeholder sets, but between industry and the government, between the private sector and those who are charged with carrying out and serving the public interest. And I think that, with respect to changes that we have made in terms of positions that the United States has taken as recently as 2019 and 2020 in our digital trade chapters that address the issue of data flows, data storage and localization, and source code, that the realization that we have a massive problem with concentration in the technology field around those people who are collecting the data, have access to the data, has become an enormous issue that we have to grapple with in trade, and an area where the trade disciplines and the trade representative and the antitrust enforcers have been thrown into each other's worlds.
A follow-up question before I move to Francisca, and then we'll move it around. How is this vision of yours being received, or how are you essentially disseminating this to Europe, but indeed also to the global south? I know you've been recently to South Africa and had a meeting with the Minister Patel, and that's what we want to hear from James too. But this is important. This is not a sense, there's a suspicion the United States are doing something really novel. We don't sort of know what they're up to. Describe what you think is going on.
So it's always helpful to break things down to the basics. The basics are that the Biden administration is pursuing economic policies across the board that are trying to reverse decades of top-down, trickle-down economic growth theory, that you just grow the top and you wait for it to trickle down. You see how it's fueled our trade policies too. And what we're trying to do, and you hear the president talk about this all the time, is grow our economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And it's about democratizing opportunity, democratizing economic opportunity. And that's driving the changes that we're pushing in trade and the changes that we're pushing on antitrust. Here's the thing, we're not the only ones. We're not the only ones who've looked around the world and around our own economy and realized that we have a problem with respect to inequality and widening inequality, that the rich, the super rich, keep getting richer. And the people in the middle and the bottom keep facing more and more obstacles. There are fewer pathways from the bottom to the middle, and fewer opportunities for the middle to expand. And so that is one of the most important conversations in trade, which is to bring that conversation into the dialogues that you have with your partners. We'll say that South Africa, I have learned so much about South Africa's posture with respect to its economic policies connected to its history, and I have found that we have actually quite a bit in common. And so that means that whether it's in competition policy or in trade or in the intersection of the two, there's a tremendous opportunity here. And being here in Brussels today is telling me that there is a growing opportunity between us and the EU and others like South Africa to continue to grow this conversation, because I think that the fate of the world order to come and the economic world order really lies in our hands to be successful, to put forward an affirmative vision for how we are going to democratize economic opportunity by working together.
Wonderful. Let me turn to Europe. Let me turn to Europe and Franziska Brandner from the German Parliament. It's great to have you here, Franziska. It's such a shame you couldn't be here in person. Europe has been, of course, undergoing massive stress as a result of war, the implications of war, the effect on energy prices, the pandemic. We all know, we heard in the previous panel a great intervention by René Repasi talking about the way to think about industrial policy or industrial strategies being central to revitalize where we are. How will you give us a perspective from where you are about the connection between these areas of policy? And I care in particular because, of course, in an antitrust conference, it is important for people to really kind of see how the dots connect. Please give us your view.
Yes, thank you. And yes, I'm sorry I cannot be with you, but it's a plenary session and we're voting on the budget. So it is quite a critical week, but I'm happy to, at least digitally. It's a pleasure to see Katherine Tai, and I really agree with her on the points she has made, and it's an honor being with her on this panel. Allow me to start by saying what are our objectives, and I think these were laid out by Katherine Tai quite well in terms of its efficiency, yes. It's also innovation. How do we make sure that our systems are set up so that we can have the best innovation? And of course, and that's maybe we haven't looked at so much over the last 30 years because we didn't have to, is resilience and security. And I think that this triangle between innovation, efficiency, and resilience, security, and you could add justice, or what we were talking about in terms of how much remains with the workers, etc. These are the points that I think we have to bring together. And as it was said, we should never forget that be it a competition policy, an industry policy, or a trade policy are all tools and not ends in themselves. So I think when we talk about, I want to give 3 examples, one for the competition, industry, and trade policy, where I think we need to rethink it in a joint way. When we look at trade, for example, and our supply chains, we have seen that they are quite efficient, but maybe not as resilient to external shocks, be it the Houthi attacks now, or Corona, or geopolitical other concerns. So we have an interest that we have, for example, in the area of raw materials, not just more raw materials coming from a variety of states across the world, but we also have an interest that the refining process, for example, is happening in a variety of countries, and if possible, also in partner countries we share it. So the question is, how does this fit together with trade policy? Our partners ask for the option of having a dual pricing system where they can use their raw materials to a national price to any company in their country investing in refining opportunities. And that is because otherwise they will not be competitive because, let's be frank, the Chinese is cheaper. So if we have an interest in diversifying our supplies for our own resilience, and we have an interest in our partners having more of the wealth that their earth has also remaining in their country, we have to change our trade policies towards these countries. And they're demanding that. And I think this is a mutual interest we have, but it has certainly important ramifications for trade policies. And I'm flying next week, by the way. You were talking about South Africa. I'm going there next week to the Indaba, the largest mining conference in Africa. And this will certainly be part of the issues. Second point, when you're talking about industry policies, we have a lot of public funding. And in Europe, usually the funding goes to the consumers, and it doesn't discriminate of what kind of product the consumer chooses, which has a very strong importance for innovation and efficiency, But of course, then comes the question by my taxpayers, Ms. Brandner, you're paying 10 billion for e-cars, and how much of that goes to German car makers? But at the same time, you really want to make sure you get the cheapest, the most innovative, and the best cars. So I think there's a trade-off that we really have to look at very carefully. And last point on the competition policy, and this is an old standing question of what is the right level of analysis? How do we make sure the monopolies are well defined in a global perspective, in a geopolitical perspective as well? And I'm glad what was said on the data and digital. I think that there we really have to look in two dimensions. It has become more difficult there. The one is the security question that was talked about. These are infrastructures that are key, critical to our safety. But also even within the private sector, you have competition on who has access to data and who can take what kind of data. So the data monopoly question, I think, is key. And it again has ramifications on trade. If our data is allowed to be exported, for example, by BYDs cruising in Europe or Tesla cruising in Europe, but our Mercedes cruising in China can't take the data out, this is a competition question. And how do we solve that with trade, within the trade realm? So I think there are many interlinkages that come from a readjustment within the objectives that we have as politicians, as a society, and I think as Western partners and partners with also important countries in the global south that share the same values and interests to make our world a bit more resilient and at the same time equal out a bit of who benefits from our trade.
Wonderful. Rana, I will want you to complement or to partner up with me in asking questions because this is an area that you know well. But before I wanted to give you the heads up. But of course, now I want to hear from James. This is not a conversation which is the global north. It is a conversation that is critical to the global south. And of course, you've been at the receiving end of trade policies from the north, which have shaped in so many ways your markets. Where has that led you and where do you think the change is needed?
Thanks, and it's good to be here, Christina, at last. I think, funny enough, I probably came from a trade background, industrial policy, into competition law through trade and services. And so it's interesting to see the linkages between the two. And I think we forget that trade policy affects competition and concentration. And I'm going to give one classic example where we're active right now, and that is digital. So since '98, there's been a moratorium on digital tariffs in the WTO. That's up for review every 2 years. And this year, South Africa has put in a proposed decision that we end that moratorium. And I'll tell you why. I mean, Gabriel, I think, mentioned earlier the tax advantage of locating in Ireland or Bermuda. But in fact, it's the moratorium on digital tariffs that makes that possible. Because I can tell you every transaction from Google, Apple, Microsoft, Uber, and we could probably go on, goes through Ireland right now, where the tax is paid there at a very low rate. No tax is paid in South Africa. But that is because there is no digital tariff. If there was a tariff, as we see in many other industries, then the location decision has to be made about where you locate. Few of those companies make any significant investment in South Africa, and ironically and sadly, we're faced with when we challenge in an antitrust manner, we're told that, in fact, we don't have jurisdiction because they don't have a legal entity there. But that is facilitated by a trade policy where you have a zero tariff. And effectively, what it has done is also result in lower competition in countries like South Africa. One may think mostly about the big Apple, Googles, and Metas of the world, but the digital economy is much broader. And what we've seen in the last while is many companies in certainly developing countries emerge, and they may use similar business models, but they're the first entrants into these digital intermediation markets. But late entry from the global companies on the back of this advantage means they can, in fact, acquire consumers. They can put that saving and benefit into consumer acquisition, taking the lead and pushing them out. So we're actually seeing almost an industrial or digital deindustrialization happening gradually in many of these developing countries. And that inequity is problematic. I think it's problematic because we're going to end up with a bigger digital divide than we maybe anticipated in the beginning. And that can contribute, of course, to global instability and the like. But it has another problem for antitrust, is it concentrates markets gradually. These countries like South Africa could be breeding grounds for competitors too. But if they're gutted out through these sort of trade policies, then in fact we do have a problem. So I think on things like digital trade, and I'm glad, Katherine, you mentioned that, because it is a big area to rethink. You mentioned data, that's an angle, but we need to think about it in a much more expansive manner than we maybe have thought about traditional goods and services. So there are questions around, we think of traditional anti-dumping. Well, what if a company is set up in a low tax or no tax environment as cheap venture capital and comes in on a loss leader basis? In competition law, would be stuck with predation and proving predation, which would be incredibly difficult. But are there ways to tax it? We've just seen in Canada on the media industry, Meta just switched off the news. Well, is there another instrument other than antitrust? And I think this idea that was mentioned about silos and our instruments, we need to think about the use of all instruments in order to bring about the kind of market structures, equity that we see and aspire for under each of those different policies.
More broadly, in South Africa, you've had traditionally a vision of antitrust as being married with public interest and certainly not the pursuit of efficiency as your main lodestar. How is that unfolded? Where do you think you are? And what is it that you see in Katherine's vision that helps you and connects with what you are thinking in South Africa?
Yeah, that's very funny. I always say, having come from the trade side, that if you pursued a consumer welfare standard in trade, you would end up with, obviously, no tariffs, free trade. But no one pursues that. We also say, well, in antitrust, it's very hard to weigh up consumer with other things. We do that all the time in trade. We precisely try and balance these different forces and come out. To the point Katherine made, well, if you don't have a job, you can't consume. And so I think, South Africa has been banging that drum for 25 years. And we're, of course, thrilled that others are listening at the same time. I think just to link it back to the trade and I would say investment side, I mean, something that almost a decade old when Walmart entered South Africa, we worried about how does foreign investment, it obviously brings benefits, but it can also take away. So in that case, it was, are we going to see supply chains shifting globally away from locally, which would undermine that resilience, undermine our own economic development? And so the approach has been conditionalities that are often mutually agreed, but which allow not only the benefits to the foreign investor, but also the benefits to the local economy. So a lot of the shift, you hear about a lot of our different parts of public interest, but one that maybe isn't as visible are the conditions placed on developing supply chains, because if you build up that supply chain, you build up that resilience. So more recently, Heineken, PepsiCo have all invested in South Africa and agreed to try and ensure that is resilience and consumption locally. I think going forward, there are big questions for us, I think, about dealing with a globalized environment with a disjointed antitrust because you have your jurisdictions. We mentioned digital, but things like food, it was mentioned earlier, 4 traders run. But I think that's a failing in antitrust equally. We can tell you each of those 4 traders has done many acquisitions in South Africa, but they've also done them in Argentina, in Brazil, in Canada, Australia, the US. And it's a form of global merger creep that does fall through the cracks. And how do we deal with that? Do we deal with it in our own merger control by saying, well, this is an international market, we shouldn't worry, we're not going to see competitive effects? Or do we say, economic shocks are so frequent now, should we, as one of our counterfactual, say, well, what if there's a trade shock? What market do we have left, and do the remaining players have market power? We've seen that play out over the last 3 years. We've seen, and it was mentioned already, but if firms can protect their profit streams whilst consumers and others cannot, is that a form of market power? Is that a form of strategic coordination? And should we worry about those outcomes? So I think there's a lot. I think the area of trade and competition policy is really underdeveloped, and we really need to expand our thinking on that front.
Well, Christina very kindly asked me to jump in with a question. I'm actually going to try and pull together a few threads, and then I want to pose a question to Ambassador Tai. Something I was really struck by is the speech that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, gave last April in the U.S., basically saying, look, we know the Washington consensus is sort of over. It's broken. There are certain institutions that are no longer working. We need growth, not just for its own sake, but growth that is sustainable and inclusive, dealing with inequities, dealing with climate. Ambassador Tai then really amplified a lot of these ideas and added some of the bones of a new trade paradigm. But we're going in now to an election season. We're going to hear a lot of anti-China rhetoric. We're going to hear there's a huge big tech lobby in the U.S. that is pushing the national champions argument. So none of this, by the way, is in Europe's interest. If you could, Ambassador, how would you like to reframe the system as it exists right now, and what message would you like Europe to take away from what the Biden administration is trying to do?
That's a great question. It's a huge question. In terms of reframing, one of the connections that I've taken from trying to push myself into acquiring some antitrust proficiency is that antitrust, competition, anti-monopoly, whatever you call it, is about taking on the problem of bigness. I know that's not a word. It's also not an adjective, but as a noun, bigness, or an adverb actually. Bigness, it's distorting, right? And it's fundamentally blotting out. It's unfair. It's bullying. In the international trade conversation, because we are international, and as I understand it, we're part of the reason why we are disconnected from our antitrust colleagues is because their jurisdiction is domestic, right? You have to look at your market. We're constantly moving between markets, but internationally, we also confront the problem of bigness. To Francisca's point about concentrations of supply, and if you take that supply chain of critical minerals, which is sort of the starting point for everything else, we have a huge problem of bigness around the world in one particular country, and that's the Chinese PRC economic system that operates so very differently from ours, giving us a challenge of bigness. But I think I might, as I was listening to James talk, it occurred to me, if you take it all the way back to sort of the very elegant and simple, maybe too simple, theory on which this free trade dream was built, David Ricardo's paradigm of, two jurisdictions, they both have diversified production, and then for efficiency's sake, and truly efficiency, each one should focus on what they are best at and then trade, right? It's elegant and it's very, very attractive. But we see that it doesn't really translate into the real world for lots of reasons that we could get into. But it occurred to me listening to James that part of that paradigm is that each country should become a monopoly. It should concentrate on the thing that it does well. And I think that therein lies a fundamental challenge with that vision and where it is running up against problems in the real world. So, I think it reframing requires us to take all of our assumptions back to their basics, but then also to superimpose and to put it against the real life data just the evidence that we see around ourselves of how things are going. And I think at this moment of incredible change and multiple inflection points, what we are seeing is that the world is changing, and resisting the change isn't going to work. So it's going to be about embracing it and putting forward a positive vision for what you're trying to work towards. And I think that that is the question that certainly I have been posing to all of my partners, which is to move them off of the traditional conversation that feels more and more irrelevant to this one, which is we use different terms, but for us in the United States, the middle class is this magical place where everybody wants to be in the middle class and everybody thinks that they are part of the middle class. The middle class is a place of opportunity, upward opportunity. How do we build our middle classes together? And I think, Rana, you and I have talked about this before as well. I think in terms of a vision for the next world order, the next iteration of globalization, that question is really crucial to breaking out of some of these colonial and immediately post-colonial structures. And if I might, one question I would pose to James about competition policy in South Africa, and going back to your history, is I think, as I understand it, competition policy is actually written into your constitution and your founding documents as an aspect of your democracy as it was born in the post-apartheid period. And that, for me, is really a profound realization in terms of transitioning out of old systems and trying to create new ones that are democratic and competitive.
James, you want to answer this?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that, out of apartheid came a highly concentrated economy that had excluded most of the people of the country. And so the only way that competition policy, which is, you could say, making the market work, could be accepted in South Africa was that it had to incorporate those other elements of inclusion, of fairness, and the broader public interest. And that's why it is accepted, that's why it's championed. If it was of the style that we saw in the US in that same period, I don't think it would have any political or public support whatsoever.
I want to give a last opportunity to Franziska. Of course, you are in Germany, but we are facing a European election this year. How do you see that breaking of silos that you discussed? You talked about 3 pillars of policy. You talked about multiple inflection points. Katherine and Heather before were very clear about the whole-of-government approach, which is a common direction of travel. Do you see this in Europe? This morning we heard that, antitrust is a side dish. I don't agree with that, respectfully, but how do you see in the next commission potentially this coming to a better place?
Yes, thank you. And I just, if you allow me 1 second on what Ambassador Tai just said, what Katherine just said, in terms of the Ricardo and the efficiency and innovation. And of course, that was all thought without the resilience and security point, because then, you might have monopolies, and that's a monopoly question, but it's also a risk. And I think this has to be taken into account again. And it's a real fact. And you cannot just say, in theory it shouldn't be there. De facto it is there. So we have to deal with it. And when you talk about the EU, and I think it's very important to think about what the next commission and the next legislative term of the parliament should do. We have in the EU this difficult scenario where the trade policy is an exclusive EU policy and industry is basically a national policy, especially when it comes to funding. And then you have the competition policy, the antitrust law, which is sort of in between. And that creates sometimes wrong incentives to bring it together. And I think that we as Europe can no longer afford not to bring those 3 better together. And I think the next commission really has to work hard on this. And we have to modernize also all areas of them so that we can have better partnership with partners worldwide on a more equal footing. And I think this is our German and our European responsibility, is to rethink what these policies mean in the world where we really want to have another cooperation with countries like South Africa, Brazil, etc. And I think that is a challenge to all of us. And I hope the next Commission will address it and also, talk about justice within our member states and across our member states and then more globally. But that justice question about how do we divide the gains will be a key for saving our democracies.
Wonderful. I think, Katherine, you ended on a very high note. Your last remarks talking about the role of all this in the next world order. This is indeed why I named this conference in this way. But if you have one final 30 seconds and would like to leave us with a message, then we can all hear the rest of the panel. Thank you.
I think Francisca's given me the best segue. I think at the end of the day, in terms of our disciplines, you have to ask what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And, for those of us on this panel on behalf of the United States, the European Union, South Africa, what do we have in common? We're democracies. And so that's an aspect of our political philosophy. It's about empowering our people to participate in our political systems. And then, well, what's the point of that? It's so that they can maximize their potential and that they can have access to economic opportunity for themselves and for their children and their children's children. And I think that that's really just a basic part of each one of us, I think, can relate to that. And if we can ground what we're doing in that recognition, we have so much more in common than not. And frankly, given all the change around us, that political participation, democracy, that type of inclusion, but also the economic inclusion, I think our valuing of those concepts and ideas is really important for how we navigate into this next world order. Well, how best to end? Let me ask you to give a round of applause to this panel. And then the three of us will leave and Rana will do the last segment with her panel.